Good evening. It's Thursday, the 17th of December. Here are our top stories. Category 5 cyclone Yasa makes landfall in Fiji as the entire nation takes shelter. French President Emmanuel Macron tests positive to COVID-19. And Sydney's Northern Beaches coronavirus cluster grows to 17 cases. And increasing support in Australia for a controversial Indonesian cleric. You're watching The World. Hello there, I'm Yvonne Yong. Also tonight, how a sexual harassment case sparked China's Me Too movement and calls for cultural change. Now, the entire population of Fiji is taking shelter this evening as severe Category 5 cyclone Yasa has now made landfall in the Pacific Island nation. A state of disaster has been declared and a curfew is now in force as hundreds of thousands of Fijians are in the path of the slow-moving storm and more than 1,000 evacuation centres have been set up. Now, let's take a look at the latest satellite imagery from AccuWeather to see how the cyclone is tracking at this moment. As you can see, the eye of the storm has crossed the northern main island of Vanua Levu and the main town there is Lambasa. And what it's also showing is that this massive storm system is covering the entire country, including the southern main island of Viti Levu, where the capital Suva is situated. Now, these are the latest pictures from across the country. The Fiji Met Service says Yasa is bringing wind gusts of up to 345 kilometres an hour. And it also warns that heavy rains will bring flash floods and landslides. Extremely rough seas are generating waves of around 14 metres high with damaging heavy swells on the coast. Authorities are expecting the Category 5 cyclone to continue tracking further southeast. And there are also reports of widespread power outages. By 11 a.m. local time tomorrow, the storm's centre is expected to be around 230 kilometres away from the capital, Suva. Well, Fiji's Prime Minister Frank Bainimarama says climate change is seeing worse and more destructive weather patterns hit the region. Speaking in a video posted on Facebook earlier today, he's called on Fijians to be as well prepared as possible.
We will be instituting the nationwide curfew from 4 p.m. today until 6 a.m. tomorrow, until further notice. Unless you are evacuating, that means stay off the roads and stay safely sheltered. As you know, as the world is getting warmer, these storms are getting stronger. Every one of us must treat these climate-fueled catastrophes with deadly seriousness.
Well, let's go live now to Suva, and I'm joined by local resident and communications advisor Patricia Mallam. Now, Patricia, we just heard there from the Prime Minister who's warned Fijians to take this really seriously. How are residents preparing for the storm?
Well, I think in the history of all of the cyclone preparations I've seen, this has got to be one of the better ones. People seem to take heed of warnings and be a lot more prepared than they have for as long as I can remember.
Can you update us on which areas have been hit so far?
Well, from what we're hearing from the local news as well as friends that are situated on that part of the island, Vanua Levu seems to be the most affected so far. There have been, damaging winds as well as videos and photos that have been shared among friends of exactly what sort of damage has been brought about in Vanua Levu.
Yes, we have been seeing pictures of floods and really strong winds there. Mm-hmm. How safe do you feel where you are in the capital, Suva?
Well, compared to what I've seen and what we experience here, I would say that being in Suva, we feel a lot safer. I saw a video a few minutes ago of one of the evacuation centres in Jakarta having its roof peeled off, almost like a can of sardines. And in Suva, although it's raining and we're feeling winds, it's nothing like what we've seen in the videos that we're getting.
It really is frightening. Meanwhile, the power is out for many parts of the country. How are those affected coping?
Well, because we have been aware that this was going to be sort of this bad, a lot of people have, solar lamps and torches, as well as candles and kerosene lamps. So for those that I know who've had their power, who've had no electricity for a while, they're faring quite okay with the alternatives that they've got. But I think the biggest struggle is if that is a prolonged situation, then you get issues like, access to refrigerated food and even, certain water pumps and things not working because of lack of electricity.
Indeed, the country is under curfew until tomorrow morning. How are residents feeling? It is a slow-moving storm and the worst could still be yet to come.
Yes, that's true. And I think it was more of a safety measure more than anything. And it was good to see that people took that really seriously and were in their homes well before the 4 p.m. curfew.
Just 4 years ago, the country had to deal with the destruction left by Cyclone Winston. Could the impact of Yasa be worse? What are you expecting?
Well, in my opinion, I think it is going to be a lot worse because we're already dealing with trying to build back from the impacts of COVID. And just a few days ago, I attended a forum where, members of government institutions, other NGOs, as well as private sector got together to talk about what recovery for the tourism sector looked like in light of COVID. And already that was a difficult conversation to have. So you can imagine with the double impact of, trying to recover from COVID and then trying to recover from a natural disaster for communities that are already struggling, that's going to be really, really challenging.
I can imagine it would be a very different situation from 2016 when the last devastating cyclone hit. We also had a cyclone earlier this year in April as well. That must have been hard to have coped with as well during the pandemic.
Oh, yes. I mean, like the other issues aside, when you talk about economic recovery, like the basics of access to health and sanitation, those pose a lot more challenges in a time of disaster, because when you're trying to have people, maintain cleanliness and social distancing, and then you've got a cyclone that forces people into evacuation centers, and you really got to rethink how are we going to contain the spread of a pandemic at the time when you've got a natural disaster. So you can imagine how difficult it is for countries in the Pacific when we go through natural disasters.
Extremely challenging. The government has declared a state of natural disaster for the next 30 days. What does this mean for residents?
Well, that's the question that a lot of people are kind of pondering at the moment because, as you know, businesses are already struggling. Lots of people have already lost their jobs. So now with the restrictions on movement and that, it will test a lot of people and also perhaps be the avenue for a lot of social enterprises that are going to be created to look at how we maneuver in a time of so many restrictions.
Yes, indeed, and residents still very much need to stay alert in the coming days. Patricia Mallam, thank you so much. Please do stay safe.
Thank you.
And we'll get more on Cyclone Yasa with Nadi-based meteorologist Neville Coop a little later, so do stay tuned for that. Now, French President Emmanuel Macron has tested positive to COVID-19. It's not known at this stage how Mr Macron contracted the virus, and the presidential office is in the process of identifying close contacts. Well, the presidential palace says he will isolate for 7 days and cancel all upcoming trips, but continue to work remotely. France has the highest number of coronavirus cases in Europe, with at least 2.4 million infections so far. The COVID cluster in Sydney's northern beaches has jumped to 17. Frantic contact tracing is underway to try to contain the outbreak. WA and Queensland have begun to introduce some travel restrictions, with fears the holiday plans of thousands of people could be ruined.
A week before Christmas, many would have been expecting to queue at the shops. Not for a COVID test, but as the number of confirmed cases climbs, the line for a swab swells.
Not good. Not good for Christmas. Very surprised it's happened in Avalon, actually.
Hundreds have been waiting at clinics for most of the day. For a handful, this is their second attempt at testing.
Came down last night and queued for 2 hours.
We waited till about 9:30, then they had to cut it off.
Among the new infections are a worker at a retirement village in her 50s, her partner and a musician in his 60s.
Interestingly, the band is called Nothing Too Serious, so certainly from our point of view, I wouldn't say it's exactly how we feel.
It is serious, considering the band's schedule. They played at the Avalon RSL last Friday, the Penrith RSL on Sunday and the Kirribilli Club a day later. Anyone who was there at the same time should be swabbed.
These people who have come forward as heroes to put themselves there and to be tested, and now they're doing what they need to do.
That could include spending Christmas in self-isolation for some. Everyone at the Avalon RSL at any time last Friday has been ordered to isolate for 2 weeks, even if they test negative. That's because 3 of the cases were there that day.
But they're not the source of the infection. We need to find the source of the infection. That's why the genome sequencing is going to be so critical.
The festive plans of people in some aged care homes could also be in doubt.
We're recommending no visitors until we identify the source of the infection and feel more confident that we have it under control.
New South Wales is the gold standard, so I don't spend too much time worrying about New South Wales.
The other states do. Queensland says it'll only shut its border if the situation in Sydney worsens.
The action that we take will be based on what intelligence we can get. That may involve naming geographic hotspots.
The West is also waiting for health advice.
If we need to, we'll put up a hard border with New South Wales. I realise that would be very upsetting for many people.
Passengers arriving in Perth late today have been told they'll have to quarantine.
Unfortunately, while your aircraft has been in the air, there's been some changes to our legislation here in WA in relation to quarantining. Okay, but the good news is, and I'll get straight to that, it's not 14 days. Okay.
Not the Christmas surprise travellers are counting on. Rani Hayman, ABC News, Sydney.
Well, further afield, coronavirus cases in Japan are soaring, forcing the government to suspend a domestic travel campaign aimed at stimulating the economy. Now, Tokyo has recorded its worst day for new infections with more than 800 cases. That's at the end of a 3-week period, dubbed critical to containing the spread. North Asia correspondent Jake Sturmer reports from Tokyo.
Holidays are a time to travel, see the family and wish for good luck at Shinto shrines, which are busily preparing for an influx of visitors. But this year, it'll be a little different. Many Japanese are heeding health warnings coming early to beat the crowds and COVID. A stark contrast to the 2 million people who usually visit this shrine in the first few days of each year.
Healthcare services will be strained if the infection spreads because of socializing during New Year's. People should spend their holidays quietly.
With an eye on the economy, the government persisted with a scheme to boost the domestic travel industry despite mounting health warnings. But cases are spiking as winter sets in and people head indoors. In one hospital where 197 staff and patients tested positive, it's even had to deploy military nurses. And it's now suspended the travel subsidy scheme.
Travel should not necessarily be blamed for a surge in new cases, but we will focus on measures to curb the spread during the holiday period.
Suspending go-to travel was the right decision. However, this will only prevent the virus spreading in regional areas, so we need to reduce big gatherings in cities like Tokyo and Osaka.
restaurants are still doing all they can to encourage customers to keep coming in as safely as possible. Some are delivering food by robots.
Other venues are going much more low-tech. This shop serves its food and drinks with disposable face shields so customers can continue eating and drinking uninterrupted. It's a pandemic-prompted touch that seems sure to stick around. Jake Sturmer, ABC News, Tokyo.
Well, China has agreed to allow a World Health Organization team into the country next month to investigate the origins of coronavirus. Beijing has been reluctant to agree to an independent inquiry, causing a series of diplomatic rows with other countries. No WHO scientist has been allowed to visit Wuhan, where the virus first was detected, since February, and the organisation has had to rely on data from Chinese researchers. But the WHO hasn't confirmed whether the team will visit Wuhan, saying discussions are ongoing.
WHO continues to contact China and to discuss this, the international team and the places where they visit. And these meetings are, of course, important for us to understand and get an overall picture of how the investigation will go. Now, our understanding at this time is that China is welcoming the international team and their visit, and that this is anticipated, as far as we are aware, to happen in early January.
Former US presidential contender Pete Buttigieg is set to become the first openly gay cabinet minister in US history. President-elect Joe Biden appointed the former Navy officer and mayor to head the transportation department. Mr. Buttigieg rose to national prominence in the race for the Democratic nomination earlier this year. The 38-year-old will also be the youngest person in the incoming cabinet, if confirmed by the Senate.
The eyes of history are on this appointment, knowing that this is the first time an American president has ever sent an openly LGBTQ cabinet member to the Senate.
Mr. Biden is touting his administration will be the most diverse on record, with 9 barrier-breaking roles so far, including his Vice President Kamala Harris. Now, the popularity of Indonesia's controversial Islamic cleric Rizik Syihab continues to grow following his arrest over the weekend. And while some see him as a figure in Indonesia's hardline Islamist politics, some of his supporters in Australia say he is so much more. Tasha Wibawa reports.
When firebrand Muslim cleric Rizik Syihab returned to Indonesia, he received a hero's welcome. Shihab's appeal attracts hundreds of thousands, both at home and overseas. Although much smaller than rallies in Jakarta, echoes of support can be heard all the way in Melbourne. Australian resident Muhammad Edwards says he doesn't align with Shihab's political party, the Islamic Defenders Front, but says the cleric stands for something lacking in Indonesia's current government: stability, at a time where the nation is struggling.
This is as a result of the government policy itself. The rhetoric that government use in itself is actually dividing people.
Shihab spent 3 years in Saudi Arabia in self-imposed exile after facing pornography and other criminal charges, which was later dropped. Over the weekend, he was arrested for holding mass gatherings in violation of Indonesia's coronavirus social distancing restrictions.
His return to Indonesia comes as the country grapples with the highest number of coronavirus deaths in Southeast Asia, killing close to 20,000 people. Rizik Syihab's largest supporter base is in Java, Indonesia's most populated island, which has also been the hardest hit by COVID-19.
Rizik has been a symbol of grievances against the current government, or more broadly, the social order, precisely because all of the parties in Indonesia right now, except for 2 of them, are in the coalition with President Jokowi.
Last week, 6 of its supporters were killed during a stoush with Indonesian police. It's a tricky situation for Jokowi's government that is struggling to deal with the cleric's reinvigorated support base. Tasha Wibawa, ABC News.
Returning to Fiji now, where a powerful superstorm is tonight lashing the Pacific Island, bringing with it destructive winds, flooding and massive waves. Neville Coop is the director of the Nandraki Weather Service, and he says parts of the north and east are still expecting the worst to come.
So here in the Western Division of Fiji, the weather is quite benign. We have missed the worst of the weather, and the focus really is on the north and the east of the country. In Nadi here, it stopped raining several hours ago. Winds have abated significantly, and the weather is a little humid and steamy, but otherwise not too bad at all.
I understand, though, there is a power outage. How extensive is that, and which areas is it affecting?
So my understanding is that the Fiji, the electricity folks in Fiji here have shut down power as a precaution prior to the commencement of the destructive winds. And so right now, most of the main island of Fiji level is without power as part of a planned shutdown. There is parts of the country with power who are near local diesel-powered stations, such as around the airport here in Nadi and also around Suva. But for the most part, power is off.
How does the strength of Yasa compare to Cyclone Winston in 2016, which killed dozens and left thousands homeless?
Yes, that's a good question. And the short answer to that is that it's as strong, possibly slightly stronger. Certainly as it approached Fiji, it was one of the strongest cyclones up there with Winston that I've seen in this region. The sustained winds near the centre were estimated to be around about 250 kilometres per hour. That's average winds over 10 minutes. And there were gusts of around 350 kilometres per hour. So as you can imagine, that's pretty brutal.
So how is the storm likely to progress in the coming hours, and which areas do you think will bear the brunt of it?
So we've been quite lucky, I would venture to say, in as much as it approached Fiji from the northwest and crossed the westernmost tip of the second main island, Vanuatu, earlier this evening, just on sunset, about 6:30, 7 o'clock local time. And it's now progressing across that island and is expected to shortly pop out over water again south of Vanuatu in an area, the Koro Sea, it's called. It's a very shallow area, a lagoon of water that is quite warm. So we expect that as it crosses the island, it will lose a little bit of intensity. From there, it's going to progress southward and stay. We expect around early morning, so about 8 o'clock local time, the centre would be about 200 odd kilometres, perhaps a little more, to the east of Suva.
Well, it seems like still a few hours out from what could possibly be the worst of the storm, yet on social media we're already seeing floods, fallen trees, roads blocked by landslides. How are residents coping under the circumstances?
So those images are coming from Vanuatu, the western part of that island, and also some of the far northern Yasawa Island groups, which is another pretty remote part of the country. These are relatively unpopulated regions, but certainly those people who are in that area, the situation will be absolutely devastating. The winds are extremely dangerous. The flooding would be, it's still raining and raining heavily, and that will continue for at least another 12 hours or more. So for those in the direct path, it is going to be phenomenal.
It really does sound frightening, Neville. This will be the second cyclone Fiji has seen during the pandemic. Harold hit in April this year. How much more difficult is it to prepare for such severe weather amid a pandemic?
Yes, look, Fiji has been blessed with having minimal pandemic transmission of COVID. The numbers here are measured in the tens and the deaths in single figures. So we don't have a lot of COVID concerns insofar as transmission amongst the community. But of course, the COVID impacts in Fiji are different in that it's devastated our economy already, and it's also meant that many local people are suffering severe financial hardship. But the economy is going to be what really hurts after this.
Well, our thoughts are with everyone in Fiji right now. Neville Coop, thanks so much for taking the time to talk to us. We really appreciate it.
You're welcome. Thank you.
In the wake of a joint media investigation into the poisoning of Russian opposition leader Alexei Navalny, President Vladimir Putin has said the activist wasn't important enough to be a target and the findings were a trick to attack Russia's leaders. The report identified a network of Russian security agents who allegedly stalked Mr. Navalny for years before poisoning the political activist with a deadly nerve agent Novichok before he boarded a flight in August. Russia's foreign minister said it comes as no surprise the US and Western countries are making accusations against the Kremlin.
All this news is amusing to read, but the way it's talked about is the same and shows that our Western partners' lack of any ethical norms or normal habits of diplomatic work, as well as willingness to adhere to international legal standards while establishing facts.
In China, a former intern has ignited the country's Me Too movement by taking a high-profile TV host from national broadcaster CCTV to court. The sexual harassment case is currently adjourned, but it has the potential to change Chinese society, as Jordan Butler explains.
Defying the cold and police, crowds gathered outside a court in Beijing hoping to see justice for 27-year-old screenwriter Zhou Xiaojuan.
其实就是那天对于我来说的感受其实很复杂的，因为我既有10个多小时的开庭，其实我那天主要的时间其实是在开庭，就是在法院里面，在法庭里面。我担心这么多人来关心我，大家会失望。其实特别是有很多是年轻的小妹妹，
Zhou Xiaojuan, known by her nickname Xianzu, has accused popular TV host Zhu Jing of groping and forcibly kissing her when she was an intern at China's state broadcaster CCTV in 2014. Zhu Juan, who did not show up to the hearing, denies all wrongdoing and is suing for defamation. In China, it is unusual for cases like Xianzu's to even get to this stage.
Unfortunately, the court system seems to be more open to, as a route for alleged harassers to file defamation suits or file violations of labor contract with their company for being punished, than it is for survivors of sexual harassment to access justice.
In the past, authorities have sought to quash the growing feminist movement in China. In 2015, 5 feminists were detained for planning a campaign against sexual harassment on public transport. Li Miyazu was one of these women. She went to the court to show support for Xianzu.
Before Me Too, people might think not all cases can stand a trial and tend to believe it can't get you anything but constant humiliation. China doesn't have a rich ground for a movement like Me Too to grow.
Censorship remains one of the biggest barriers for Chinese women wanting to come forward. On the day of Xianzu's court case, local media were told not to cover it, and at least 2 foreign reporters were dragged away.
What is really miraculous about the Me Too movement or the feminist movement in China is that there is one at all, because China is the world's most powerful authoritarian regime. There is no internet freedom. Whenever you post a Me Too hashtag or something related to sexual violence, or feminism, it's often deleted within minutes, if not seconds, by censors.
In New York, feminist writer Leta Hong Fincher says Xianzu's case is pushing Chinese society forward.
The momentum for the movement has become so broad and so strong that it's really difficult to wipe out at this point. And so you can see the government is trying to give a little bit of space to the movement, and that's extraordinary.
For Xianzu, her fight continues. Behind the closed doors of this courtroom, the case was adjourned to a later date, but that is not stopping her. She's calling for Zhu Jing to appear in court and for all 3 judges in her case to recuse themselves.
前真好勇敢啊，现在没有那么勇敢，现在如果随口讲，就是如果都同意在前面等着我的话，我还是不能往前走的人，就是愿意往前走，然后遇到才能去。
While it's not known when Xianzhu will be back in court, win or lose, her story has become a defining moment for China's Me Too movement. Jordan Butler, ABC News.
A Chinese space capsule full of lunar rocks has landed safely back on Earth. No one was on board the capsule, which touched down in Inner Mongolia. Recovery teams arrived an hour after the landing. On board, a very special cargo, around 2 kilograms of lunar rocks, the first fresh moon samples in more than 4 decades. To what in the world now, and face masks have pretty much become the norm during the pandemic, but a Japanese artist is producing a series of hyper-realistic masks that you simply can't unsee. Back in October, Shuhei Okawara put the call out asking if anyone was willing to sell their likeness so he could turn it into a three-dimensional mask. After receiving over 100 offers from around the world, he decided on 3 designs. Okawara wouldn't elaborate on the scanning and production process, but as you can see, they certainly do the trick.
It's surreal to have a situation where there are a couple of people with the same face. I think it would be fun to create a situation like that. So many people are asking me to buy their face, and the number of people that want to buy these masks was more than expected too.
The artist also refused to disclose the identities of the people who took part, but if successful, chances are you see them around regardless. You're watching The World. The top stories we're following tonight. Fiji residents take shelter as Category 5 cyclone Yasa makes landfall. French President Emmanuel Macron is isolating after testing positive to COVID-19. And frantic contact tracing is underway to contain Sydney's Northern Beaches COVID cluster. Behind the Wall with Stan Grant will be up next, but let's get an update first on Tropical Cyclone Yasa that has made landfall in Fiji. A nationwide curfew has been announced across Fiji and a state of national disaster declared. The Category 5 storm is bringing winds of up to 345 kilometres an hour across the South Pacific nation, along with torrential rain. Prime Minister Frank Bainimarama says the impact could be worse than Cyclone Winston in 2016, which killed more than 40 people and left tens of thousands homeless.
After intensifying through yesterday, Yasa is a Category 5 storm that could easily surpass the record-breaking strength of Cyclone Winston. The impact forecast for this latest superstorm is more or less the entire country. Over 850,000 Fijians are in the direct path of the cyclone, more than 95% of our population.
It's time to check in with international affairs analyst Stan Grant in our Behind the Wall segment. And today we'll be looking back at the year that's been for China, in particular its relations with the US, Australia and other powers in the region. Now, Stan, Donald Trump's former National Security Advisor John Bolton says the way China's treating Australia at the moment is a sign of things to come for the rest of the world. What does China want? What is its end game?
Yvonne, it's an interesting observation that from John Bolton, because many people see Australia as the canary in the coal mine, if you like, here. We're really at this hinge point of history where we're seeing the rise of China versus the United States and a return of great power rivalry. And because of our close relationship with the US and because of our big trade ties with China, that we are really caught in the crosshairs of this. And really what China wants to be seen as a great power. It's watched the United States and the United States dominance of the world and how the United States builds that presence and that dominance around an idea of American exceptionalism. Effectively, if you're a great power, you write the rules. China now wants to be able to write those rules. You know, the Chinese have a very long history of humiliation as they see it by foreign nations, and now China has emerged as an indispensable nation. It is the biggest engine of economic growth in the world. It is on track to be the biggest economy in the world, perhaps as soon as the end of this decade, usurping the United States. Now, all of those things mean that China demands to be seen. I think you can wind the clock back a little bit earlier than that. You can go back to 2017, and that's a critical year to mark a shift in the way cooperation between the big powers. Chinese eyes are part of what they see as an effort to contain China's rise. And that's where you go to that call for an inquiry into coronavirus. That is...
Beijing just isn't picking up the phone.
Well, the World Trade Organization is there precisely for that. If you can make a case, and there appears to be prima facie a case like that to the World Trade of conflict. Now, The Hague saying that it couldn't do that. So
Biden administration make to the
Joe Biden when it comes to how China... We would expect that Joe Biden would build on those alliances. He is someone who, long game, we know that Xi Jinping over the past years Russia. There are close ties with countries like Pakistan, with Iran. But at the same time, there has been an erosion of Chinese standing amongst Western liberal democratic countries. We've seen increasingly in parts of Europe, of course, Australia, the United States, more countries following Australia's line, for instance, in banning Huawei and being involved in the rollout of their 5G. So there has been a deterioration in China's standing amongst liberal democratic countries, even as China seeks to increase its influence, its economic might around the world and build alliances with other countries. What's going to be critical is to watch how countries in our region respond over the coming year. They were very quiet when you consider the tensions between China and Australia. We haven't seen a lot of Southeast Asian nations, for instance, come out and support Australia directly. What are they going to do? How will they play that? That's going to be critical to watch as well. But this is a long game from Xi Jinping.
And we will be watching closely what happens. Thanks so much, Stan, as always.
Indeed. Thank you.
Some breaking news now, and the WA government has announced that New South Wales will move from a very low-risk state to a low-risk state from tonight. From midnight tonight, anyone arriving from New South Wales will be required to self-quarantine in a suitable premise for 14 days. The arrivals will also be required to be tested for COVID-19 on day 11 of their quarantine. Returning to France now, where it's been revealed President Emmanuel Macron has tested positive to COVID-19. Let's get the latest with our Europe correspondent Samantha Hawley. Now, Sam, what do we know about Mr Macron testing positive and contracting the disease?
Well, a statement from the Elysee Palace today didn't give it a lot of detail. It did say that he had developed some symptoms and was tested very soon. After that, he tested positive. He'll now be self-isolating for 7 days, but they did say that he would still be working from self-isolation, and that a source from the palace also said that he was actually feeling very well. Now, the question, I suppose, is also who did he come into contact with during the week? There was some notable people. In fact, the Portuguese leader met with him this week on Monday, and the Spanish Prime Minister as well. So they may need to also, of course, self-isolate. There's no word yet on whether President Macron's wife has also tested positive or whether she is also self-isolating. But just a really short statement, I think, from the palace to say that the French president is positive, the latest in a string of world leaders, of course, to test positive, and that he will be self-isolating but still working. Of course, we saw Boris Johnson early on in the pandemic develop the virus, very seriously ill in intensive care. And of course, Donald Trump also had it. Others too, of course, the Brazil president also contracted COVID-19.
And Sam, this comes as France really battles to get COVID numbers down in the country.
Yeah, and I mean, that's a problem across Europe now. Of course, we're seeing it in all countries, including in the UK, a real spike in the number of infections as we lead up to Christmas, and countries really battling with the question of whether or not there should be hard lockdowns over that Christmas period, that people shouldn't really be allowed to gather over Christmas. We saw in France yesterday 17,000 new cases of COVID-19, 2 million cases they've had since the start of the pandemic, absolutely huge numbers. And also the death toll continues to rise. 59,000 people have died in France from COVID-19. A curfew is now in place there from 10 p.m. till 6 a.m. In the morning. Oh, I beg your pardon, from 10 p.m. to 6 a.m. So many of the restaurants, etc., have closed. So yeah, a nation that really is battling with an upward trend, as we see in Germany as well, that's now been locked down, and here in the UK, London, of course, has been locked down this week as well.
Some devastating figures there. Sam Hawley, thanks so much for updating us. And let's go back to Fiji, where Tropical Cyclone Yasa has made landfall, and authorities are warning of destructive winds and potential landslides from heavy rainfall. The Category 5 storm, the highest ranking, is bringing winds of up to 345 kilometres an hour and torrential rain across the South Pacific nation. The Director General of the Fiji Red Cross says there's a high level of concern in the face of a storm predicted to be the worst in the nation's history.
There's a high level of anxiety with our community members because where the storm is expected to come through, a lot of them have not fully recovered from TC Winston, and a lot of people have been, their family resources have been affected by the COVID-19, people losing jobs and going back to communities. So the anxiety of what they're going to do over Christmas period is causing quite a level of stress.
The first repatriation flight from Paris has touched down in Darwin this morning. The Qantas plane with 146 people on board, including 3 infants, landed at Darwin's RAAF base. They've been taken to the Howard Springs quarantine facility. It comes as a further 2 people tested positive to coronavirus at Howard Springs. The 2-year-old boy and 16-year-old girl arrived on a flight from Chennai on Tuesday. Since repatriation flights began, around 1,800 people have arrived in Darwin, with 35 of them testing positive to COVID-19. The next repatriation flight will come from London and is due to arrive on the 30th of December. New Zealand Prime Minister Jacinda Ardern has announced the country has secured enough COVID-19 vaccines for the entire population of 5 million. Inoculation is set to begin in the middle of next year after 2 new agreements were struck with pharmaceutical firms AstraZeneca and Novavax. Ms Ardern said the vaccine rollout will be the largest in the nation's history and will begin by immunising those at greatest risk.
Our first priority here will be to vaccinate border workers and essential staff in order to further reduce the risk of COVID passing on to the community. We expect vaccines to be delivered to our frontline workers in the second quarter of 2021. Keeping in mind, of course, we still await the data to demonstrate the effectiveness of the vaccinations that are currently being developed in reducing transmission between people.
A French court has sentenced 14 people linked to the 2015 Charlie Hebdo killings and an attack on a Jewish supermarket in Paris. 2 brothers shot dead 12 people at the satirical magazine's office following the publication of cartoons depicting the Prophet Muhammad. A day later, an associate killed a policewoman, then carried out a deadly rampage at a kosher supermarket. The 3 Islamist militants died in separate police raids. Prison terms for at least 12 convicted accomplices range from 4 years to life. The Brazilian government will begin a mass vaccination program against COVID-19 in February. President Jair Bolsonaro says more than $5 billion has been allocated to buy millions of vaccine doses once health regulators give their approval to one of the recently launched vaccines. The move marks a significant change in Mr. Bolsonaro's stance on the pandemic, which has killed more than 180,000 people in Brazil. 2 former dancing bears have been saved from a controversial zoo in Islamabad. They're the final animals to be rescued after a court ordered the zoo be closed after years of campaigning. The Himalayan brown bears are being flown from Pakistan's capital to a sanctuary in Jordan, where they'll be rehabilitated and share thousands of hectares of forest with 10 other bears. Late wickets have given Australia the upper hand on day one of the first test against India under the lights at the Adelaide Oval. Indian captain Virat Kohli has never lost a test after winning the toss and looked set for yet another century before being run out in the final session.
Australian Test cricket returned with a welcome to country. There were anthems as well, and best of all, after such a difficult year, the fans were out in force. India opted to bat first and was immediately on the back foot. Dreams of more wickets failed to materialise for Mitchell Starc, although he looked menacing more than once. It took until the 10th over for the first boundary of the innings as the Indians dropped anchor to wait out the Australian assault. Alas for India, Pat Cummins sailed on in. The dismissal brought Virat Kohli to the crease with his fans immediately on their feet as the skipper's footwork was tested by some short stuff either side of the lunch break.
Well, that was in the air for a short while.
The introduction of spin allowed a few more scoring options and Kohli was happy to take it on.
An authoritative stroke from Kohli.
At the other end, the patient and considered Cheteshwar Pujara finally broke his boundary duck after 148 deliveries.
Oh, it's got there.
His vigil lasted just another 12 balls before Nathan Lyon claimed his scalp. India 3 for 100 and vulnerable entering the final session under lights. Ajinkya Rahane, though, provided good support for Kohli.
That's a good sweep shot.
The pair shared a half-century partnership, looking increasingly comfortable against the short ball, only for a shocking run-out to undo all the good work. The dismissal came just before the second new ball was available. Rahane departed when it was taken.
Struck on the pads and given.
Neil Cross, ABC News, Adelaide.
The ATP says the Australian Open will begin on the 8th of February, but qualifying will be held in Qatar. It could mean a long round trip for Australian players at home who need to qualify for the tournament. The ATP schedule also includes 3 tournaments in Melbourne the week before the Open.
After weeks of uncertainty about the Australian Open, it appears the dates are in.
We'll cancel whatever plans you have.
The Victorian government is yet to tick off on it, but the ATP says the Melbourne Park Slam will run from February 8. The ATP schedule has tournaments in the USA and Turkey in early January, while Australian Open qualifying in Qatar will run from the 10th to the 13th. Players will then all fly to Melbourne to quarantine for 2 weeks. Once that's completed, there'll be 3 tournaments in Melbourne, including the Adelaide International and a 12-team ATP Cup, as warm-ups for the major. The WTA is yet to release its schedule, but is expected to have 2 lead-up events in Melbourne. For Australian players at home, a trip to Qatar looms as a tough prospect in order to qualify for their home slam.
Crikey.
Attention will now turn to which players will come to Melbourne.
I love you, Roger!
Roger Federer was hoping for a later starting date to help recover from his knee injury, but Rafael Nadal has confirmed he's in. Peter Lusted, ABC News, Melbourne.
In boxing, Australian Tim Tszyu says he's confident of setting up a world title fight next year despite potential coronavirus travel constraints. The 26-year-old knocked out Kiwi challenger Bowen Morgan inside the first round in a devastating performance at Western Sydney Stadium last night.
I didn't expect to land the big shot straight away. I was planning to go a little bit longer, but I was planning for the knockout. I'm getting bigger and stronger by each day.
The victory gives him a chance to fight for the super welterweight title in 2021, currently held by Brazilian Patrick Teixeira. Depending on travel restrictions, Tszyu could have a shot at the belt early next year, and he wants the fight to be hosted in Sydney. And it's time for the weather with Graham Creed.
Still looking at some severe thunderstorms through parts of New South Wales and Queensland, and with a very humid air mass, the potential of heavy rainfall is going to be a feature with those. We'll see a trough and a front move through New South Wales, so a southerly wind change rolling through, and that's what's going to help spark these widespread showers and storms, although a little bit more likely around central regions. Showers and storms also possible through many parts of Queensland apart from the southwest. Very heavy rainfall across the top end. This is as the monsoon trough has formed. We're also looking at a severe weather warning for much of the north and northeast. That's for damaging winds, heavy rainfall, also the potential of abnormally high tides.
Before we go, recapping our top stories, Fiji residents take shelter as Category 5 cyclone Yasa makes landfall, bringing strong winds and heavy rain. French President Emmanuel Macron has tested positive to COVID-19, and New South Wales arrivals to Western Australia will need to self-quarantine for 14 days. And that is your world for tonight. If you'd like to see more world news and interviews, take a look at the ABC's YouTube channel. There'll be more news after the break. I'm Yvonne Yong. Bye for now.